Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, November the 9th, and on Tuesdays we have In the Headlines with Mr. Dwoskin. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angela. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in for our weekly current events discussion. I have quite a number of things I wanted to speak about today, but I wanted to start off with the municipal elections, which just took place all over Quebec. And the system that we have is a very interesting one, whereby every single municipality where an election is taking place, all takes place on the same day. And so the whole province has had elections this past week. The results are mostly available on the government website. I spent about 2 hours looking through them just before this morning anyway. And some interesting ones, some interesting results. And it's interesting from a sort of demographic point of view to see how immigration has had an effect on Quebec, because at one point, as we all know, immigrants were mostly located in and around greater Montreal. But as time goes on, they tend to spread out, and now you see sort of immigrant names running for city councillor positions, even in the far-flung towns in Quebec. So that kind of is an interesting, an interesting phenomenon in a way. It's also interesting to see, how much of the Anglophone community is left in rural areas of Quebec, because you can look at the list of candidates running for different positions in townships and see how many English names there are. And there are quite a number of them scattered all around the place, all around the province, we'll say, especially in areas where Anglophones have tended to live for a long time. So that's, kind of a bit of an introduction. The city elections in Montreal were, of course, very interesting. The turnout was not great. I believe I saw a figure of somewhere around mid-30s% of eligible people voting, either 35 or 38. I'm not quite sure which. We had the same two candidates running this time as last time, meaning Valérie Plante for Projet Montréal and Denis Coderre running kind of as the opposition. The last election, which took place, I think 4 years ago, the turnout was a 4% better, and the results for Mr. Coderre were much better. It was quite close last time, and Valérie Plante only won by a couple of percentage. But this time she really did win by quite a lot. Her total amount of votes, which was around 213,000 to somewhere around 140,000 for Denis Coderre, was really quite a large win. And even if you took all the other candidates and added them all up together, Valérie Plante won more than half of all the votes cast for all the candidates in the municipal elections in Montreal. So it's really quite a, I would say, vote of confidence in her administration. Indeed, not only did she win the mayor's job, but a good majority on the city council went to her as well. One of the most interesting and maybe surprising results was in the largest borough in Montreal, which is Côte-Neige NDG, which is the borough immediately adjacent to Descaries Boulevard and all of NDG and all of Côte-Neige. And Lionel Paris, who was the outgoing mayor of the borough, it seems as if he lost an extremely close race by somewhere like 60 votes. He lost to the Projet Montréal candidate, who is this Congolese-born woman who's really pretty unknown, I would think, in terms of political circles. And she managed, unless unless this is overturned in a recount, she managed to win by just a handful of votes out of somewhere, in the thousands of votes cast for that position. Part of the reason was that the vote was split in that borough. Sue Montgomery won 10% of them. By the way, the two winning candidates, Lionel Perez and Grace, I forget her last name, they each won close to 33% of the vote, but the rest of the vote was split among several other candidates. And this may explain why the Projet Montreal candidate did win. Also important or interesting to note is that the Hasidic candidate, Mindy Polak, who ran, in a very sort of, we'll call it a revolutionary way, a female Hasidic person running for a city job in Outremont. She got 82% of the vote in her race, and she was, in other words, she won election by a huge amount, and she got votes not only from the Hasidic community, but from the general community as a whole in order to get 82%. The other news in Outremont was that the Céline Forget, who was a kind of a noted we'll call her anti-Hasidic candidate, who had succeeded in getting herself elected in the last elections, she lost this time. She was the person who would put up cameras and make complaints about Hasidic school buses blocking access and things like that. She was known to be a strong anti-religious candidate and kind of the bugbear of the Hasidic community in Outremont, and she lost her position. The other person who lost, surprisingly enough, was the Projet Montreal candidate in Outremont for mayor, Philip Tomlinson, who, again, this might go to a recount, but it was a 50-50 vote, and he ended up on the losing side for the mayor of Outremont. But again, this might be changed in a recount. What won't be changed in a recount is the contest for the mayor of Hampstead. And that's where William Steinberg, the longstanding mayor of Hampstead, lost quite convincingly by 55-45. You might recall that probably the only issue in that race was the idea of going on Cote-Saint-Luc Road and knocking down some of those old apartment buildings and putting up 10-story condos. And this is what the mayor wanted. And, obviously there were opponents to that idea. And it looks for sure that those apartment buildings will not be redeveloped. So I would say that, for the sort of Montreal area, that's kind of the highlights. Other places, Mayor Brownstein in Cote-Saint-Luc was reelected, although the son of the former, the late Ruth Kovac, who he ran kind of in her place. He was defeated. If you might recall, he left a very nasty phone message on the answering machine of Mr. Torgman, who was the opponent to Mr. Brownstein. And that got recorded and played back. And, I guess that might have sunk his campaign. So overall then, the elections were carried out without much fanfare and without much, we'll call it, any kind of extraordinary activity. I think that municipal elections are greatly underrated because of their importance to the day-to-day life of the citizens of the different towns in the province and elsewhere. Remember that our municipal officials are the ones who we have most contact with and who affect our daily lives the most. in terms of street maintenance, garbage collection, sidewalk repairs, water mains, the fire services, all of the sort of daily activities that we sort of base our lives around. Many of them are run by the municipalities, and these officials are, for the most part, overworked in a way and underpaid. And for many people, it's a municipal politics are a stepping stone to higher up politics. I did notice that there was a Jean Charest who won an election in some small town in Quebec, and a Lucien Bouchard who also won election in some small town in Quebec, but I don't think those are the originals. But it was just interesting to see their names, in the list of candidates. Many of the elections were not held because the candidates were already acclaimed. So in other words, and some entire towns, the mayor and the councils were all acclaimed, meaning there was no election. People just decided they didn't want to run against them, or everyone was happy with the way things were going. So there were many of these cases where individual seats, or the mayor, or even an entire council was acclaimed. One of the interesting things that I saw looking through lists after list after list of candidates is how many women candidates there were and how many succeeded in their quest of becoming mayor or town councilors. Really, it's quite remarkable. There's so many mayors now of different towns who are women, and this is really a big change from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, when that would be extremely rare. One of the women who didn't win was in Quebec City, who was favored to win, and she lost kind of a very close race to the underdog who did win in Quebec City. The complete results are not yet published, and I'm quite disappointed in trying to find out, especially in the city of Montreal, borough by borough, what the results were. But for some odd reason, they haven't been published yet, but I guess they will be, in the near future. So leaving that aside now, I sort of said to myself, we haven't done this in a while. And I said, let's take a tour of the Middle East, to kind of go country by country and just point out, sort of a headline sort of fashion, or a shorthanded sort of fashion, what are the newsworthy points that have been published recently. What are these countries known for? Not going into their whole histories, but just looking at what is happening in these places today, why they're making the news. And I think, it's quite, we'll see how far we'll go on this, because there's quite a bit. But, let's see how it goes. So I'm going to start off with Turkey. And, one of the most important Middle Eastern countries, one of the biggest, one of the most populated ones. If Turkey were considered to be a European country completely, which of course geographically it is both in Europe and in Asia, it would be excluding Russia, it would be the biggest country in Europe in population. And I read something quite interesting recently, which is about rumors about the health of Mr. Erdogan, that he has been seen several times in a kind of unhealthy situation, not being able to walk properly, not being able to concentrate. Of course, him being a strong man and his image being a strong man, these rumors are shot down. Journalists are threatened not to publish this type of information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But and other times he seems to be fine. So it's a dilemma, I guess, but it could be a sign that he's got something seriously wrong with him, or it could be a sign that he didn't sleep well and forgot to wake up. One thing that is for sure is that compared to just about every other country in the world, the currency in Turkey has collapsed down to 9 lira to the dollar. Inflation is the highest in Europe. As a result, the economy has suffered tremendously because of a lack of tourism, one of their major economic pillars. The cost of oil has doubled, so we'll speak about that in terms of other countries. But Turkey is an oil importer, and when you have to when the price of oil goes from $40 a barrel to $80 a barrel, which is what it is now, and when your currency is collapsed and you have to pay for oil in US dollars, trouble is right there. Turkey is one of the themes that we're seeing these days is the use of refugees as a tool, as a bargaining tool, as a political tool, and even as an economic tool. And we were just reading about this in terms of Belarus. If you look at the papers these days, you'll see that Belarus has kind of invited Middle Eastern refugees to come to that country, and then they're getting pushed over the border into Poland and Lithuania. Well, Turkey has the same situation. Turkey has millions and millions of refugees living in the country, mainly Syrian refugees. And from time to time, when Mr. Erdogan, the head of the country, gets upset with its European neighbors, it just says, okay, it brings these refugees to the border and kind of directs them to go across the border to Greece. And he's done this several times already. And what he's achieved with this action is to win billions of dollars of aid from the European Union to kind of hold the refugees back and not let them flood into Europe. Because if they flood into Greece, Greece certainly can't manage to deal with them. And Greece will then push them just into the next country and the next country and the next country. And all of Europe will be caught up again in this, this sort of immigration flood, which causes not only economic trouble, but political trouble for all the countries involved. So Turkey is still giving refuge to millions of Syrians, to thousands of Afghanis, to thousands of refugees from even from China, from the Uyghur minority in China. Turkey is still involved in Lebanon, backing the rebels against Mr. Assad. It's also involved in Libya because it's backing the current government in Libya. And in exchange, Turkey has won the rights to have pipelines go under the Mediterranean, bringing gas from Libya to Turkey. But those same pipelines are conflicting with the routes of pipelines which are supposed to be built between Egypt and Europe, between Israel and Europe, between Israel and Cyprus and Greece. And so the potential for a conflict is there, regarding undersea gas exploration and shipping. Turkey is still, of course, backing the Palestinians, it's sort of a conflict with Israel has not gotten any less strong. It may well be that with this new Israeli government, they will try to make some sort of peace overtures with Mr. Erdogan, but Mr. Erdogan's kind of opposition to Israel is a tool for him to make himself look good to his own people and to the Arab and Muslim world in general. So right now, as I said, Turkey is really in kind of on the back foot as far as all of its international involvements are concerned, and its economy in particular. So unemployment is high in the country, and it may well be that, coming elections, Mr. Erdogan will be pushed out because of a combination of tiredness of his regime and a lack of success in dealing with COVID and in dealing with the economy. So that's just a quick note. Now I'm going to pass on to, this is going to be the format. So just to give you some idea, that's sort of the format. Let's look at the next country, Iran. Has certainly been making the news lately for many, many reasons, especially having to do with the nuclear development deal, the one which Iran was being sort of rewarded for not producing nuclear weapons. President Trump felt that this was not a very good idea, so he pulled out of this nuclear agreement. When he did that, Iran started again to enrich uranium, and this enriched uranium could be used as a kind of a nuclear weapon. President Biden is trying to inch his way around this issue, trying to figure out if there's some sort of way to walk his way back into this multilateral deal that was made with Iran without America looking weak and without rewarding Iran for bad behavior. So, that particular issue is still up in the air. The Trump government put sanctions on Iran, preventing oil from being exported or gas from being exported from Iran. However, not all countries are agreeing with these sanctions, and Iran has been able to sell oil to China, to India, to Pakistan, and to other Asian customers who are not abiding by the boycott of Iranian products. Iran is still involved heavily in Iraqi politics. They are trying to, and they are influencing the political life in the country. There were just elections in Iraq that were held, and Iran strongly backed one of the Shia political parties, which actually lost the election. Iran has also been still involved in backing Syria, backing the Assad regime, and Israel has attacked Iranian targets in Syria, including this past week, where there are constant kind of attacks against Iranian weapons and Iranian weapon transfers from Syria to Lebanon. So the Hezbollah are strongly backed by Iran, and Israel is trying to break that link between those two enemies of Israel. The other thing that Iran is doing is it's involved in cyber warfare. So you know what cyber warfare is? Using the internet and using the world, the computer world to attack targets. And Iran has developed some strong expertise in this area, and they actually shut down an entire Israeli hospital where the Israeli hospital has still not been able to build back its records that were lost in this cyber attack. Israel, of course, is doing the same thing to Iran. Israel closed down all the Iranian gas stations in a cyber attack. So this sort of tit for tat business is going on. Iran is also physically involved in attacking or hijacking ships carrying oil in the Persian Gulf, and they've done that a couple of times. Iran is especially not happy with the United Arab Emirates' recognition of Israel or Bahrain's recognition of Israel. And of course, they're not happy with Saudi Arabia, which stands as the kind of strongest enemy to Iran in the Persian Gulf area. The position of the regime in Iran still seems to be strong enough. They held some demonstrations just recently against America, which turned out thousands of people. But as we all know, regimes which are essentially dictatorships can collapse very quickly once the momentum goes on the other side. Iran held elections recently for president after eliminating all but a few conservative candidates. Mr. Raisi was elected as the president, and he presents a harder line, more conservative thought process than his predecessor, Mr. Khatami. And I still say, and I will continue to say, that 42 years after the Iranian Revolution, which kicked out the Shah, that theocratic regime is still going strong, and it has not really been seriously challenged by the opposition forces. It seems as if their grip on the country is still very, very strong. Their support, especially among certain of the lower classes, is still quite strong. And, they just seem to be going on and on. So a theocracy, in other words, rule by religion, by religious authorities, is not an outlier in a way. Afghanistan, was just taken over by the same kind of religious, conservative, fanatical authorities. And, that's so far the way things are going there in the country. In Iraq, I mentioned that there were elections recently, and there were. These elections were mostly boycotted. The turnout was under 50%. I think it was 41%. But they were, in a certain way, fair elections. In other words, there was fair competition, fair advertisements of candidates. They tried to arrange the system of elections so that there would be more candidates from more different parties elected. The winning party was a Shiite party backed by one of the Ayatollahs, Mr. Sadr, who was a strong nationalist, a strong Shia supporter, but not a Shia supporter who wants Iranian involvement. He's also strongly anti-American. And the rest of the troops, US troops that are in Iraq, I'm sure will be gone sooner rather than later. One of the things about Iraq is that it is an oil producer, and so it is benefiting from these oil prices, but it has so many other challenges, namely, the climate change issue has been very strongly felt in that country. The extra heat and the drying up of the rivers is notable. The water flow down the Tigris River and the Euphrates River is reduced from what it used to be. And so the country, for whom this is the only source of water, is in a certain sort of we'll call it a bad time in that sense. The situation with the Kurds in the north part of Iraq is basically unresolved. By and large, the Kurdish province is autonomous. They're trying to run things on their own. Ideally, they would like to separate from Iraq and make a separate Kurdish country. But, this is not possible under the current circumstances. And there's this kind of delicate dance between Kurds who run the Kurdish province, who, when it suits them, say that they're a part of Iraq, and when it doesn't suit them, say that they're not part of Iraq. But the Kurdish area is developing kind of independently, and its economy is going much better than the rest of Iraq's. The Kurds do have a source of oil on their own. That oil is being exported through Turkey. They've gone so far as to have informal relations with Israel, which is certainly taboo as far as the mainstream Iraqi government is concerned, based in Baghdad. There have been terrorist attacks in Baghdad. There has been a reawakening of ISIS, which was defeated, as we all know, in Syria and in Iraq by a whole combination of allied forces, Kurdish forces. But they are making a comeback with bombs here and there. So life in Iraq is not stable. The economy is not good. But if things can simmer down and oil prices stay high, some of this money will be able to come back into the sort of coffers of the country for to be spent on the well-being of the country. Of course, corruption is still very strong in all of these countries, including Iraq, and a lot of the wealth of oil just gets siphoned off and never sees the light of day in the country itself. Lebanon has been in the news much lately, as we all know. There was a battle, there was a street battle between Christian forces and the Hezbollah in Beirut, which resulted in 6 people being killed. The economy of Lebanon, as we know, has collapsed really badly, just as badly as worse than the other countries that I mentioned. There used to be 1,500 Lebanese pounds to the dollar, and now there's 21,000 Lebanese pounds to the dollar. I just checked the rate yesterday in case you have extra Lebanese pounds lying around. They're losing value by the day. If you have US dollars lying around and you want to invest some in Lebanese currency, you will be able to get 21,000 Lebanese pounds for every US dollar. Of course, 21,000 pounds doesn't buy what it used to buy. And that's the economic problem. The huge explosion in the port of Beirut a few years back caused a huge amount of damage, devastation, and 200 deaths. Mainly it was the Christian community who was affected because they were the ones living close to the port. But it was the Hezbollah who were in charge of that part of the port, and they refused to allow independent judges to question some of their leaders to say, what were you doing there, and why did you leave all this explosive material in the port? And they threatened to cause trouble if the judges continue in office and if they get subpoenaed. So this is just another point of instability in the country, in a country which is really suffering quite badly. In fact, anybody in Lebanon who has a foreign passport, like, maybe a French passport or a Brazilian passport, Argentinian passport, they're leaving the country because the conditions have just gotten so bad. People who are middle class are now living poor class lives. And as I think I had mentioned once before, people are looking to move into the Palestinian refugee camps because they can't afford to live anywhere else. Israel has made, I would say, informal representations to Lebanon to try to thaw out relations. And they allowed villagers from 3 border communities to cross into Israel to work in the olive harvest in Israel, just as a kind of a gesture of neighborly goodwill. Israel is also trying to negotiate with Lebanon on the demarcation of a maritime border for gas exploration. So there is potential for gas production in Lebanon, but things are so up in the air that no one is willing to risk any money to start this type of activity. There are Lebanese journalists who have been calling for peace with Israel. This is another kind of a first, in a way, to say things out loud, which people didn't want to say before. But Hezbollah has a veto on Lebanese power, on Lebanese politics. They are one of the strongest forces in the country, and they will never allow Israel to have peace with that country the way they have managed to do with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. So it's a sad situation. We should remember that Lebanon received over 1 million Syrian refugees. And in such a small country, 1 million people has added almost 20% to their population. And as bad as things were, I mean, just imagine trying to be a refugee coming to a country which is in such bad condition. Imagine how bad the situation must be in Syria for people who to want to leave that country in order to come to a neighboring country where economic conditions are just as bad. It's a kind of a race to the bottom. So the Syrian refugees are willing to work for less money than Lebanese workers are willing to work for. And, as it is, the economic situation in Lebanon has just gone, from bad to worse. So that's there. Let's just take a glance at Syria because the civil war is still continuing. This is a civil war which started in 2011. So we're now 10 years into a civil war between the Assad regime and its opponents. The Assad regime has managed to win this civil war. They occupy practically all of the country, having been almost at the point of losing, and Assad almost at the point of quitting and leaving the country. The turnaround came with Russian support, Russians coming in and supporting the Assad regime, Iranians coming in and supporting the Assad regime. And if it wasn't for this outside support, he would have been toppled and kicked out long ago. There's only one province now, Idlib province in the far northwest of the country, which is not controlled directly or indirectly by the Assad forces. Syria has been in the news because of the problem of ISIS. The prisoners of ISIS have been held in camps in the Kurdish parts of Syria, meaning the northeast corner of Syria. And they separated the women and children in one area and the men in another area. And these sort of refugee camps are turning into kind of tinder boxes. There has been a desire of the Kurds running these camps to get all of the foreigners out of them and send them back to their home countries, including Canada. And you might have seen some news items on TV, especially from the BBC, showing British women who went to Syria to kind of fight with ISIS and to marry ISIS soldiers. Their husbands are now dead or killed or disappeared, and they're kind of left alone with their children, and they would love to come back to their home countries, but the home countries are afraid to take them back because A, they might be terrorists. B, they don't want these people to influence other maybe Islamic leading citizens of their countries. They don't want to be seen as rewarding these people who might have been involved in actual acts of war, might have been involved in acts of enslaving other women, especially the Yazidi minority who was kidnapped and raped and sold by the ISIS. So they're kind of stuck in kind of the middle of these camps with very poor conditions. Some European countries have agreed to take their citizens back, especially the Scandinavian countries and Germany. But other countries like Great Britain and Canada and the US have so far not taken back their citizens who've been living there. The Russian government has become stronger and stronger in Syria. Mr. Assad gave the Russians an air base to work in. They gave the Russians a port to work in. And Russian support is so important to that regime that you could almost say that Russia has a real, let's call it a veto in the actions of the Syrian government. The Israelis have been informing the Russians anytime they want to attack Syria. They've been sort of telling Russia in advance, this is what we're going to do. Please stay out of the conflict. So far, there hasn't been a direct conflict between Russia and Israel in Syria, but Russia has supplied the Syrian army with increasingly sophisticated weapons and anti-aircraft supplies and anti-aircraft missiles. And one of these days, it could happen that, you know, the two sides will confront each other. As far as I know, there's a hotline, a kind of a hotline between Israel and Russia in case anything goes wrong, that Israel can sort of explain right away what happened. And, you know, this is an area of extreme instability in the Middle East. The number of people in Syria who have been displaced by the civil war is half of the population. So in other words, out of a population of 24 million before the civil war, 12 million of them have either left the country or have moved to other areas. And, you know, clearly that country is still not in any kind of condition to be self-supporting. Syria does have a small oil industry, and that oil industry will benefit like the other ones that I mentioned because of the higher prices of oil. But the number of Syrians who are now living abroad in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan are in the millions. And some of them have made their way even into Canada. You know that our Prime Minister agreed to accept 25,000 or so Syrian refugees, and these people have already arrived and are making new lives here in, you know, this country. The next one to have a look at, let me just check my time again, is the Sudan. The Sudan has been in the news this week for lots of different reasons. So Sudan is an extremely poor country just to the south of Egypt and just to the west of Ethiopia and to the east of Libya. And it's a country which has, in a certain sense, a lot of potential because it is relatively well watered by the Nile River. It's a country which, unlike many other countries, is not hugely overpopulated. It has a seaport on the Red Sea. Doesn't really have any, at this point, oil or gas discovery, so that's a minus for them. They had a president, Mr. Bashir, who was in power for a very long time, who committed atrocities against his own population, who was judged by the United Nations to be a war criminal. A warrant was issued for his arrest. And, despite this, he was able to travel abroad and not get arrested. But finally, he was overthrown by a kind of a combination of civilian uprising and military uprising. And this revolution happened less than a year ago, or around a year ago. And to replace Mr. Bashir, it was agreed to set up a sort of a joint military/civilian government. But this past month, the civilian part of the government was tossed out by the military part, Mr. Burhan, the general who did it, because of continuing instability in Sudan and because of an inability to agree to a kind of a permanent government. While Mr. Bashir was in power, Sudan was divided into two parts. A south part, which was called South Sudan, which is probably the newest country in the world of any size, and the poorest, just about the poorest, or the bottom of the barrel as far as countries are concerned. The poorest country in Africa, the least educated, the least urbanized, the lowest standard, the lowest life expectancy. Sudan was, in a certain sense, happy to get rid of its southern provinces because they were Black people of African descent, and also they were in the majority non-Muslim. So Sudan saw itself as an Arab country and not as a Black African country. And to sort of release the poorest provinces from the country was seen as an advantage for Sudan. And of course, for South Sudan, it was seen as a chance to finally break away from Arab rule. So in a certain sense, this was a divorce that both parties were happy to comply with. The results for South Sudan have been terrible because after the breakup, there was an ongoing and still is an ongoing civil war in that country between two or three of the big tribes of African inhabitants. There still was disagreement over small territories between the two countries, and these territories held some oil reserves. And so who owns them is still up in the air. Nevertheless, Sudan remade itself as an Arab country. And when this revolution happened, the civilians in the country were so happy to get rid of Mr. Bashir that they came out in numbers in sort of celebratory demonstrations. The problems with the country, besides just being so poor, are that the Ethiopians have built a dam on the Blue Nile River. So the Nile River, which flows through Egypt, has two branches. One is called the White Nile, which comes from Uganda. And this is a kind of a slow-moving, swampy kind of river. When it enters into the Sudan, it sort of separates itself out into many channels in swampy, mosquito-infested territory. The other branch of the Nile is called the Blue Nile. And this Nile originates in Ethiopia itself in the highlands, and it is much stronger in its volume, and it drops down from huge heights in Ethiopia down to the Sudan-Ethiopia border, where it then runs into the White Nile to form the Nile. Because of this great drop in height, Ethiopia decided to build a dam called the Renaissance Dam to hold back the water from the Nile and to generate electricity with that water to give some of that electricity to Sudan, but to keep most of the electricity for itself, for its development. Ethiopia, of course, is undergoing another civil war now, The filling up of the water behind this dam has caused a very strong decrease in the amount of water going into Egypt and going into Sudan and Egypt. And both countries are extremely perturbed by this dam. Ethiopia threatened to bomb it. There were supposed to be negotiations as far as sharing the water and sharing the electricity. These negotiations have not done well. And so this is still an ongoing issue between Sudan and Egypt on the one hand and Ethiopia on the other hand. The military takeover of Sudan by General Burhan has not been well received in the West. They've asked him to restore civilian rule. He said he will, next year. Meantime, there've been arrests and demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the extraordinary events that happened last year was the agreement of Sudan to recognize Israel as part of the Abraham Accords sponsored by ex-President Trump. And the reward that Sudan got for this recognition is that the United States took Sudan off its terrorism list. So meaning that the United States was then allowed to invest in the country, to provide aid to the country, and to welcome Sudan as a kind of a normal country in the world. Sudan had been accused of terrorism, rightly so, because you might remember the Darfur province in the west of the country, where people were massacred, where people were rounded up and sent into the desert, where people, the sort of settled population of agriculturalists were overrun by the pastoralists, camel herders and goat herders, and terrible civilian casualties were involved, and that's why the country got the designation of a terrorist country. Interestingly enough, one of the sort of ringleaders of this well, again, I'm going to call it anti-Black campaign in the Darfur, was led by the man who was briefly prime minister of the country under this new civilian administration. So far, the Israeli-Sudan Accords have been upheld. And in fact, the general there, Mr. Burhan, has had lots of contact with Israel over security issues, ordering military hardware, getting sort of cyber security things taken care of. And the Israeli government, I think, secretly regards him as a friend and someone who's not going to break the relations that Sudan agreed to have with Israel. Let me just see what else here. So that's the Sudan issue. Definitely a country which is still in the news and will continue to be in the news until things settle down there. You should also know that Sudan is considered to be such a source of potential agriculture production that many countries around the world, including the United Arab Emirates, which is basically a desert, have bought land in Sudan to serve as a kind of a breadbasket for their country. But so far, there hasn't been any large-scale industrial type agricultural production coming out of Sudan just because of the slowness in doing business in the country, the corruption, the primitiveness in sort of trying to get things going. And but this is definitely we'll call it a target for the future. Egypt, interestingly enough, unlike all of the countries that I've mentioned, has been a kind of an oasis of stability and growth in the last little while under General Sisi's rule. One of the reasons for this is that the gas that I mentioned, which is located in the Mediterranean, has begun to flow into Egypt from the offshore wells. This gas is certainly welcome. The price of gas, as you might have heard in Europe, has skyrocketed, and Egypt has one of the only gas liquefaction facilities around the Mediterranean. I mean, along with other places like Algeria, Qatar. So gas is extremely valuable, and Egypt has quite a lot of it. The gas that was discovered in Egypt, I would have to say, is thanks to gas that was discovered in Israel offshore as well. And once that was put in place, explorers went looking around the Egyptian part of the Mediterranean to see if there was gas there, and of course they found some. So that's money coming into the treasury, which is being used to subsidize life for the poorest. The Egyptian economy has grown 8% over the last year, so that's a pretty good growth rate. One of the things that the government is doing with this money is building a new capital city, believe it or not, outside of Cairo, some 30 kilometers or 40 kilometers away from the city, to try to spread out the congestion, to ease the housing shortage, to ease the traffic roadblocks, to just decongest the huge city of Cairo, which is, overgrown, where, garbage and sewage and water supplies are hard to come by, and to build a planned city sort of out in the desert, but not far from Cairo. This is not the first time in Egyptian history that they tried to move the capital. The pharaohs did this many times, and even under medieval Egyptian rule, the capital was moved a couple of times. The government this week just ordered its ministries to move to the new capital. So they don't want to turn this into a white elephant. They have, gone a fair distance in building this new city, and now they want people to move there, to work there, and to live there. So this week they issued an order to ministries to get your act together and pack up and start moving to this new capital city. I forget the name of it. They might be called New Cairo, but I off the top of my head, it just might be considered a new suburb of Cairo, so I'm not quite sure what the status is as far as the municipality is concerned. Egypt is still a poor country. It's still a country which relies heavily on foreign aid, which was coming from the Gulf states beforehand. It subsidizes the poorest people by lowering the price of bread, by lowering the cost of transportation, by lowering the cost of fuel. And of course, this is a huge drain on the Egyptian economy. In sort of other news about the country, there has been terrorist attacks in the Sinai Peninsula against the Egyptian forces. These terrorist attacks are being carried out by Islamist parties, some of whom are allied to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, some of which are not. But the country was considered stable enough that, again, this month, the President Sisi, believe it or not, lifted the state of emergency that Egypt has been under for the last 4 years. They also named 100 female judges for the first time in the country to act as judges in the courts, and to boost the position of women in the country. So that was kind of a good step for them. Relations with Israel, which have been sort of on the cold side, have been thawed out a bit, and there's been a bit more ties between Egypt and Israel. Egypt, as you know, serves as a mediator between Hamas and Gaza and Israel whenever there's an attack, or whenever there's a kind of a potential war or a real war that breaks out. It's Egypt that tries to arrange truces and ceasefires. And so it's a valuable partner for both sides. Let me speak just a little, we'll check my time. Ooh, getting close. Let me just speak a little bit about Israel and we'll finish off with that. This past week has been an enormous, we'll call it success for the new Israeli government that passed two budgets, a budget for 2021 and a budget for 2022. So, and also the Prime Minister Bennett has met with Putin, has met with Biden. The Foreign Minister Lapid has gone to the United Arab Emirates and met with the leaders of those countries. So, considering that this government was given practically no hope of surviving, it's done very well since the April elections. The budget, what's in there, is going to raise the minimum wage in Israel to about 6,000 shekels a month, or somewhere around 2,000 Canadian dollars a month, which is a pretty high minimum wage when you consider, of course, its neighbors, how poor they are. They want to devote more money to the housing crisis in Israel. There's not enough houses, and houses have gone up in price more than anything else. So they want to free up some land. They want to enable people to convert office buildings into apartment buildings. They want to give even more help to the high-tech industry, which has been a big success. And this is a kind of a first in a way, they are going to reduce the protectionism in Israel to allow imports of more food, because food prices have gone up, to allow more imports of basic food, which would lower the cost for the poorest people in the country. Inflation in the country is kind of low, but prices are still pretty high. The vote on the budget was 61 to 59, which tells you how close this is, how, in a certain sense, unstable the government is, because of one or two defections can throw out the whole government. And remember, there's about 8 parties which are party to this government. So if any one of them decides to quit, the government can fall still. Though the passing of the budget gives a huge amount of support and stability in the country, the government intends to lower taxes. It intends to provide more training in high tech. It has reserved billions of shekels to help out the Arab community, which has been neglected for so long. And of course, an Arab party for the first time is part of the Israeli government. They want to carry out reforms in several areas of the country, including reforming the kashrut, certification of kosher, to allow multiple certifiers. They want to make it easier to convert to Judaism and not hold the Orthodox rabbinate having a monopoly in this area, but to sort of spread out conversion while still keeping it to Orthodox standards. A new high-rise was announced in Tel Aviv. I don't know if you heard of it, the Toha, I should say. They already have a building in Tel Aviv, and they're building a twin of it, which is going to be somewhere like 75 stories. So it's a real sort of coup or feather in the cap of Tel Aviv to build such a big building. People are willing to put the money in. One of the interesting parts of this budget is that they want to raise the retirement age for women. Now, women are allowed to retire with a full pension at one of the lowest ages, 60, in the Western world. And they want to raise this to 65, which is no great shock, but to do it over 11 years, which is really a long time. And by raising the retirement age, of course, it will help with the employment situation. It will retain, workers where there's a shortage of workers in Israel now, as there has been for a while. Israel's been importing workers from all around the world to work, and they've even agreed to allow more Palestinians to get work permits to come into Israel from the Gaza Strip and from the West Bank. In transportation, they want to reduce traffic by installing the same sort of system they have in London, where if you enter into the city by car in rush hour, you have to pay a toll for doing that. They want to build a metro for the first time, a metro in greater Tel Aviv. You know, Israel doesn't have any kind of subway system, but they're going to build one. So a lot of big steps announced. Climate change to make Israel carbon neutral by 2050, to introduce electric buses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They also want to reinstate the agreement to establish a public prayer space at the Wailing Wall, or at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, for non-Orthodox Jews. And this was agreed to in the previous government, but the ultra-Orthodox parties knocked it down. Lastly, in general, they want to see the Israeli Arab population, which is 21% of the country, to see them as partners and not as problems. So that's a short roundup of kind of what's going on in the Middle East, and certainly it's one of the most active and newsworthy places in the world, and one of the most unstable places in the world. And up until now, it's been sort of we'll call it the prime focus for trouble in the world. Since then, trouble has spread to Africa. China's aggressiveness has spread trouble into the Taiwan Straits and things like that. But, people who forget the Middle East forget it at their peril. And all it takes is a little bit of instability, a civil war, a terrorist attack to set off new waves of violence and new waves of refugees spreading out of there. And of course, the world is all one place, so no one is immune. If trouble starts there in the Middle East, it's bound to spread to other places. So pretty well, that's about it. Let me check my watch again. Yep. Questions or comments? I'm glad to hear them. I'm glad you all stayed to listen. Angela, you're the one now. Hopefully your computer is working well enough to see what's doing as far as comments or questions. So thanks again.
Yeah, my computer is doing good.
Oh,
Mr.
good.
Dwoskin.
I can hear you. Thank goodness. I'm so happy. I was wondering because you froze there, and I was wondering if there was still a kind of a broadcast going on.
No, it's going on, but I have a comment. I think
Yeah.
there's a lower percentage of people going to vote because you're in a pandemic and you want people to move and go and vote, and then the people don't have to be vaccinated, and then it's just like they made it kind of difficult. It was easier to vote in the federal election because you were able to do a mail-in vote.
Right.
And now I think if
that's
they
true.
were allowed
I think that's a good comment. I think that's a very good comment. They did have advanced polls in the municipal elections, but it still means that you'd have to show up somewhere. The vaccination record of Montrealers and Quebecers is excellent, but not perfect. So we're close to 90% of Quebecers have received at least one shot. But that still leaves 10% of eligible people not being vaccinated, and eligible means over 12 years old. So, it's still quite a lot of people. Our caseload in COVID is down in Quebec, but not gone. We're somewhere around 7 cases per 100,000 people, if I'm not mistaken, recently. We've sort of leveled off in a certain way. Vaccinations, needless to say, have slowed down because, once you've almost vaccinated everybody, the people who are left are those who don't want to get vaccinated. So it's very hard to get to that perfect score. And so that you're right, that could be a reason why people didn't want to go out to vote, not to be caught in a crowded room. I voted in person on the 7th. And it wasn't that crowded. The people were sort of separated, and it was done indoors for sure. You had to wear a mask for sure. But we've come, I would say 80% back to the way things used to be, but there's still that 20% which are reluctant to take any kind of risk at all.
Yeah, I think also if you were allowed to do like mail-in voting, like you did in the federal election, I think they would have had a higher voter turnout. Like I wanted to vote through the mail, but they said in Montreal you have to be over the age of 70 to have mail-in voting.
Yeah, it could be that you're right. That might be true. It might be true. Mail-in voting has had its problems, and we know about what happened in the US, how the losing side contested so much about mail-in ballot and mail-in voting and called it insecure and things like that. It's an extra step for the city to accommodate mail-in voting and counting and everything else like that. But I don't know if the city is regarding this turnout as being, a terrible disaster. Remember that municipal elections in general, you never get the same turnout as in federal or provincial elections. They're not as publicized. People aren't as aware. There isn't a sort of a political party alignment with federal and provincial political parties. So there's always a smaller turnout. But when I looked at the results over Quebec and municipality by municipality, and I'm sure I must have looked at over 100, some of them were worse than Montreal, but a lot of them were better. Some of the smaller towns had over 60% turnout in their municipal elections, even though it was just a question of 300 votes to 400 votes, that type of thing. There were also a couple of seats that I noticed where there was an absolute tie. The two candidates got exactly the same number of votes. So I don't know what happens in that case. I don't know, if they flip a coin. I don't know, how they resolve that type of thing. But there were a couple of cases that I saw where it was an absolute tie in the results.
So we do have a comment, J3659649335B. It says, good review, thank you.
Okay. Is that a phone number that you gave, or is that a kind of?
That's the name. So he or she just says good review.
A secret code. Well, yeah, I think it's good sometimes to. For many of you who follow my classes, most often I'll take one subject and go into it quite deeply. But because of sort of multiple news stories and ongoing issues, I thought maybe it would be good to just do a little survey every now and then. And that's what I did for today. Next week, who knows?
There are no more comments, Mr. Dwoskin. I don't see any raised hands.
Okay, all right. So let me thank everybody again. Let me again point out, we discussed and we did look at this issue about climate change last week, last week I think it was. Here in Montreal, we're basically still sitting at way above average temperatures. Any of you who've been outside, I think it was 14 degrees, 13, 14 yesterday and today. Our normal high is 8. We have had one frost this past week, but just barely. And it's long past our normal date for a first frost. So people who've had their plants, let's say, close to their houses or maybe a little bit covered, I've got some geraniums outside that haven't been killed yet. So we're practically into mid-November and, still looking at weather that is more like early fall than late fall. And, that's what is going to be our situation for the whole rest of the week. So anyway, I want to thank all of you again for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week. And thank you, Angela, for hosting as always in your good way. And we'll see you all again next week.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening over the telephone and on Zoom. We shall see you next week. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, bye-bye.